Thank you very much, Ron, and welcome everybody. Get our levels right there, David. Yeah, okay. We're somewhere in between. Yeah, okay. All right. Now, tonight I want to speak about something which is very close to my heart, and that is the subject of science. Yes, Bruce. Yeah, I'll going to speak to something very close to my heart, Bruce. So, including the microphone, and that is the subject of science. And it's a subject which has been part of my life ever since a young man. And I had the privilege of doing a doctorate, and then from that doctorate I went on to Theological college. And I felt after I'd finished my doctorate that I was an expert in technical things, but that my faith was essentially a Sunday school faith. So I went off to Theological college to learn some new things, and I did. And in a way, that time at Theological College set me up to be able to read a lot of the material that I've read since then. Without that time and detailed and extended study, I wouldn't have had the chance to be able to read what I read today. So I've had a very privileged life, a life in which I've been able to... ready to go? Yep. In which I've been able to... look both at aspects of the natural world and also about aspects of our God and our God in Jesus Christ. Okay, so one of my favourite theologians is Karl Barth, and here he says, man is a creature who lives between the visible and the invisible, the earthly and the heavenly. So that's who we are. We're this amazing creature who is a creature of this world, and yet in being a creature of this world, we are also inheritors of a new world, which is the new world which is to come. And that promise is given to us in Jesus Christ, who shows us the way to the Father, his Father, and our Father. Now I want to talk first of all about stories. And stories are incredibly powerful things. And we just look at this beautiful young man here who's getting his head into something really good. And it reminded me of what it's like to be a young child and enter into the world of story. Somehow it inspires our imagination. It draws us into new adventures. It takes us to places we couldn't imagine otherwise. So stories themselves lead us to adventure, but they also cause us, in my experience, to take adventures. So sailing is one of my great loves, and my brother and I sailed around Spencer Gulf, took off from Port Hughes early last year, sailed up to Port Pirie and then across to Whyalla and down through Cowell and Arno Bay and Port Neal to Tumby Bay. And we had 2 wonderful weeks on the water. You get up in the morning just before the sunrise, and as the sun came up over the horizon, you thought, I've got nothing to do today except sit on this boat and just let it sail through the water. Now, I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, but for me, that was a wonderful thing. And, I can trace that back to when I used to read Swallows and Amazons, right, as a kid. And I can remember those stories about sailing off to islands, to places of mystery and wonder, and thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could do that? Stories also affect our mental health. Now, Bruce has talked to us about that, but good stories can give us very, very good mental health. But bad stories can give us disastrous mental health. Lies, perhaps told to us ever before we were really fully conscious as a young child. Lies in which we might have been abandoned, or lies in which we were told we were no good. They play out in our minds as we're adults, and it might be that when we're 50 years of age or even later, that they come back to haunt us and to remind us of stories about who we are that give us very, very bad mental health. But by the same token, we can have very good mental health if we hear the stories about ourselves which are true, and that is that we are included in the promises of God in Jesus Christ. Now, stories also lead us into action, and Ron was talking about national security, so part of what I did up until about 3 years ago was look after science and technology for counter-terrorism in Australia. So, and in that, I used to look at the questions of how we might anticipate what terrorists might do, how we might prevent terrorists from taking out their actions, how we might protect ourselves from those actions, how we might respond if we had to terrorist actions, how we might recover from the disasters. I've been watching the news on Haiti, and I've been wondering about what it would be like in Australia if suddenly our power had gone, we couldn't pump water, and our infrastructure and our society fell over, and we were thrust into the kind of situation in which Haiti finds itself. And how would we recover from that? Would we have the resilience as a people to be able to put it back together and go on when we'd lost members of our family, or we'd entered into violent feuds with other people who might live next door to us? We might do that anyway, I don't know. But anyway, action drives these terrorists. That they are born out of stories which they were told as young men and young women in their homes. And those stories have borne fruit in action. But we have the privilege of being able to tell stories too, and those stories can affect the actions that people take around us. So as mothers and fathers, we have the privilege of giving stories to our children that can change the way in which they live and act. And we also have in our workplaces the ability to change the actions of the people who are around us. Now, some elements of stories are very subtle. All right? They're not up front, and in fact we just absorb them. We absorb them like our mother's milk. They just go in, and many times we aren't even conscious that they're in there, and they play out in our lives. Now, science is an activity that, to me, seeks to reflect on all parts of the story. And that's one of the really good things about it. It tries to dig in behind and understand what those stories are and what all those little parts are. And often it's worried about the things that don't even seem obvious to us at all. But more than that, as such, it's a provider of elements of our story. So as we live in this age, a few hundred years of science, part of the stories that we tell are stories which come out of science. And Bruce and I have both read a wonderful book in which the man talks about science as the elephant in the lounge room. I might try and ignore it, but it's kind of a difficult thing to do. It's there, and all the stories of our age are influenced by science. They might conflict with it, right? So we've got a few people out there telling us that science is no good, especially climate science at the moment, and I think that's right. They might cooperate with it. So the stories might be all the way with LBJ. But whatever they do, whatever those stories are, the stories that we live with today, the dance of those stories is choreographed by science. Right? Not completely, but in a large amount it's choreographed by science. Now, given its significance for us, it's important that we have an appropriate level of confidence in science. It's important that we don't overestimate the significance of science for our lives and our society, and it's important that we don't denigrate it and push it down to too low a level. We need to develop some understanding of what an appropriate level of confidence is in science in order to be able to think and act appropriately. So, I want to think about possibly the most basic idea that we have about the world in which we live, and that is the one of space. Now, dear old Isaac Newton came up with an idea about space, and his story was that absolute space is the theatre of our lives. Right? So there it is, it's the frame in which we move, exist and have our being. Right? And it stands absolutely around us. Now, correlated with that is another story, and that is there's this inexorable quantity that flows through it and drives everything around us. Right? So people like Richard Dawkins have this story, right? And out of that comes the Dawkinology of determinism, causality, and all those other things that has made him a lot of money and a lot of fame, or infame. So this is Newton's story, right? Now, I want to ask you a question now, and that is, do Newton's ideas about space and time have theological significance? Does anybody want to be brave enough to pretty horrible to do right up front, isn't it? Adrian? Yeah, in what sense, Adrian?
Absolutely, because it impacts on our cosmology. So the way in which we understand the universe and the way everything is around us. And if we think out of how Newton saw things, and if we go along with that line of thinking, then it may impact us to see things the way he saw them, which may mean that we may miss other stuff.
So the key words there, I think, are this notion of cosmology, or the world, our worldview. Right? What it does is it affects our worldview. Yes, Bruce?
Yeah, Newton had a concept of absolute and relative mathematical time.
Yes?
And in that he's starting to promote concepts of dualism, separation between space and time. And if that becomes the basis for his cosmology, he's actually undergirded his whole thinking with dualism.
Yep. So Newton is deeply into dualism, and he has a dualism between space and time, right? Which we'll have a look at in a minute. But the thing is that word absolute, right? Whenever you see that word absolute, it sends shivers up my spine. Okay. The reason it sends shivers up my spine is because it has to be associated with the deity. You see, some of my friends used to talk to me when I was at uni about the fact that poor old Jesus had to sit up there with his harp and play it to find something to do in eternity. Right? Now, their concept of eternity was some notion of time in which you just extended it on forever to some kind of mathematical infinity. Right? And that becomes God, and poor old Jesus has to live in that. So he's only a demigod, right? Time is the real God, and poor old Jesus has to live inside that and find something to do so he won't be bored. Right? It's a completely false idea of time. False, as I'll show, from the point of view of modern science, and certainly false from a biblical perspective. So we need to be awfully careful. We need to be awfully careful when we take on board Newton's ideas, which I've got to say permeate the way in which we think, permeate modern biology, permeate modern chemistry, and I've got to say with shudder, modern psychology, which is one of the places I spend an awful lot of my time. Now here's a really interesting man, James Clerk Maxwell. And I stole this title from a book, The Man Who Changed Everything. He's completely unsung, I think, as one of the great heroes of physics. But more than physics, he had a huge impact in psychology. He was the person who discovered how colour vision works. Right? He worked out the whole three colour scheme. So when we see the RGB inputs on our television, right, it was dear old Clerk Maxwell who worked all that out. And there's some wonderful pictures of him with his colour wheel, working through all the questions of saturation and hue and all those other beautiful things that are part of our understanding of vision. Turns out he won a prize for actually predicting how it was that Saturn's rings are stable. Right? Because people had all kinds of ideas. Were the rings made out of gases? Were they made out of solids? Were they just some big disc, right, that was kind of stuck up on a big gantry or something, hanging around Saturn? And our mate James Clerk Maxwell, as a reasonably young man, worked out how it was those rings are stable as particles of rocks and dust and various other things. He was the person who started the statistical theory of gases. Now, I know that doesn't excite most of you, but if you go to university and do a course in physics, there'll be four major thrusts in physics. Right? The first one will be mechanics, right, which is all about motion, and early on it's a la Newton. The second one will be about quantum theory. The third one will be about electromagnetism, and James Clerk Maxwell is the man there. And the fourth one will be called statistical mechanics, and it will be the theory of how gases work and how solids and other things go together. So here's this guy, James Clerk Maxwell, and two of the courses in modern physics were started by him. The one called electromagnetism and the one called statistical physics, and yet he doesn't seem to rate alongside Einstein and Newton. Fascinating question, and I'll leave it to somebody else to explain that to you. I have my own ideas on why that's so. So the interesting thing is that he was studying electromagnetism. He was studying electricity and magnetism, and he put them together in a unified theory of electricity and magnetism. And in his unified theory, he came up with an understanding of the dynamic of an electromagnetic field. And when he came up with that understanding, the interesting thing is that his dynamics in those field equations conflicts with the dynamics of Newton. And Albert Einstein's great contribution to science was to show that the ideas that were behind Maxwell's theories were in fact correct, and that they should supersede the ideas that lay behind Newton's theory. Right? That was truly Albert Einstein's great contribution. I mean, he did many, many other wonderful things. So to me, the three great men of physics, and I'm sorry they are great men and not great women, are James Clerk Maxwell, Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein. So these are the three greats, and if you read Einstein's work, you'll find how highly he respected both Newton and Maxwell. Okay, now, just a little bit of a side here to do some real physics for a minute. Okay, but it's not very hard. Distance equals speed multiplied by time. Okay, so when you go out in your car, you do 100 kilometres an hour. If you sit in that car for an hour, you'll have done 100 kilometres. No, it's all pretty easy. The interesting thing is that inside Maxwell's theory was a notion that there was a fixed maximum speed. Right? Now, I just want to do something very simple with this. And that is, I want to say that what it does is it locks space and time together. If you fix speed, there is no way that you can pull space apart from time, and there's no way you can pull time apart from space. So Bruce was mentioning duality before. So there is our friend Isaac Newton's idea of time and space. They're two separate quantities, right? And the thing is that after our friend Albert Einstein, who was trying to fix up Newton, we don't see them as separate entities anymore. We see them as the same thing. Now that's all a little bit abstract, so I have sort of appealed to a little bit to cartooning here to give you some feel for what that's about. So this is from Mr. Tompkins in paperback, a book written by George Gamow. And the idea is that this delightful looking man here with a really nice hairdo is standing in a town in which the maximum speed is about 20 kilometres an hour. Okay? And this guy goes by on his bicycle. And as he goes by on his bicycle, he's pedalling it really hard. Right? And as he pedals it harder and harder, he gets squashed. Right? So it just kind of gets squashed up. Yeah? And Mr. Tompkins was so interested by that he hopped on a bike and followed him up. Right? And he's trying to catch up with him. And as he's trying to catch up with him, he noticed that when he looked out at the city in which he was riding through, as he pedalled harder and harder, it also got squashed up. Okay? So something really strange happens when you couple space with time. When you couple space with time, you start to understand that this absolute fixed thing called space that Isaac Newton wanted to talk about, in fact, is actually squashy. It's compressible. It's flexible. Right? So special relativity, which is the name given to this work by Albert Einstein, shows that space is squashy. Right? Now, Einstein took that on and showed that space is more than squashy, it's actually bent by the things that are in it. So as the space comes around the sun, for instance, it's actually bent by the sun. And so what he showed was that this thing we call gravity isn't really a field, it's actually the curvature of space. So it's actually space itself that is curved. So it's curved by matter, right? So matter curves the space, and the curved space controls the motion of matter. So there's this beautiful reciprocity. There's this beautiful interplay between what happens with space and what happens with matter. And thus we have an interdependent circular theory. Now, live with those words because they're Torrance's words. Interdependent circular theories, right? Because many of us are brought up with a Newtonian idea that theories are always linear. You start at point X and then you just drive on to point A. Delightful if you're in the military, but not actually all that close to the reality of life in my experience. Okay, so the dynamics of space-time depends on matter, and the dynamics of matter depends on space-time. There's a reciprocity. You don't pull these things apart, you put these things together. You don't have dualisms, you have unity in distinction. You have things which are called matter and you have things which are called space. They're distinct, but they're actually unified into one whole. So, these two things together, not apart. Now, just a little aside here. How flexible is space? Well, our current estimate of the radius of the universe is 46.5 billion light years. All right, light travels at 3 by 10 to the 8 metres per second. So in a year, it gets a long way. All right, and in 46.5 billion years, it's gone a long way. So how big is the universe? It's a big place. All right, and our best estimate is that about 14 billion years ago, it all kicked off in this term pejoratively called the Big Bang. All right. And at that point in time, our best understanding is that this huge universe, with all that space, was squashed into nothing. How flexible is space? Really flexible is the answer. Okay? So here's this quantity that Newton had all these wonderful absolutes and deities about, and suddenly we recognise that this thing probably came out of nothing. Right? Creation ex nihilo, I think, is the traditional understanding in the church. Okay, so here we go. We no longer believe that space and time are absolutes. So that's the findings of modern physics. Rather, we believe that space-time is a fellow creature. It's a thing like us that exists inside this world. We interact with it, and it interacts with us. I feel a lot better about that, I've got to say. It's changed by other events. Right? So it isn't something that's immutable. It's actually changeable. And its story is the story of relationships between those events. So space and time is actually a story about relationships. And that's the key that lies behind Einstein's theory of general relativity. Missed, I might say, by about 90% of those modern physicists who work in general relativity. People like Lee Smolin and others understand this point very, very well, but many others don't, and that would take me far too wide. Now, one of the interesting things is that this enables us, at least theologically, to move from a notion of chronos, tick, 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 a la Mr. Dawkins, to a notion of kairos. That is, there is a right time. There is a right time for things to happen, and when do things happen? At the right time. Okay? At the right time, Christ came and dwelt among us. At the right time. So this is about events and relationships, and the interesting thing is that that's where we've come to in terms of modern physics. But that's going to have to wait until the second part of this talk. Okay, so where do we get to with our understanding about science? And that is, science provides provisional stories about the world. Right? It doesn't give us facts. What it does is it provides provisional stories about the world. Nevertheless, they're quite good stories. Right? If you can be good enough to build Sydney Harbour Bridge or jet aircraft, more than these stories can enable us to slow the effect of cancer, and they can help us give sight to the blind. So one, we don't want an absolute confidence in these things, but secondly, we want some level of confidence in them because it looks like they're reasonably useful things. Okay. So science is a human activity that seeks to speak about an object and its environment in ways that are dictated by that object. Right? So it tries to speak appropriately and truly about the environment in which we find ourselves. So that's I think is a modern definition of what science is. And as such, it's a humble, fallible, and provisional activity. It's a humble, fallible, and provisional activity. Okay. Now, I actually want to stop here, right? And the reason I want to stop is because this is the end of the first part of my talk, all right? And I want to stop, and what I want to do is I want to ask for questions from people. If there are any questions of clarification, if there are anything you might want to say in relation to this, then please ask me. So, all right. Anybody want to disagree with it? what I've said. All right. Oh, Leanne, yes.
I've got a simple question. With the space being the circular evidence, is that why we all walk in circles when we get lost?
It could well be, Leanne. I have the same experience, so it could well be. Oh, repeat the question. Leanne said, with this circularity, or reciprocity, it's a lovely big word, with this circularity of space, is that the reason that we get lost and walk in circles? And it's a nice thought, Leanne, but I'm not sure that it's quite true. Trevor, yeah. A radius, yeah, that's what I gave it, yeah. 46.5 billion years. Why that particular number? Yeah, okay, all right. I mean, there are two numbers, interestingly enough, which one brings to bear on the universe. There's the observable universe that we can actually see, and there's the size for the universe itself. And the number I quoted was the size for the universe itself. And here's basically how it works. Albert Einstein, when he put together his general theory of relativity in 1927, wrote down some equations for the universe itself. Right? Now, how do you do that? Well, the answer is really quite simple, and that is that when you look out at the universe, there's a huge amount of galaxies out there. Billions and billions and billions of them. And the universe is an enormous space, so there's so many of those galaxies and systems sitting out there, and the universe itself is so much bigger than all of those, that you can treat them like dust particles, right? So you can treat each galaxy as a dust particle compared to the size of the universe. And so therefore you can think of it as a big dust cloud. Right? And the beauty of that is that you can start to ask yourself, well, what's the structure of that dust cloud? Right? And the best answer we know from observation with our telescopes at all kinds of frequencies, radio frequencies, microwave frequencies and optical frequencies, is that the universe is reasonably isotropic and it's homogeneous. So it's kind of clumped together at a low scale, right, into galaxies and things, but at a large scale it's kind of homogeneous. Right? So you can kind of treat it as a gas. You can treat the universe as a gas. And so that means you can write down some relatively simple equations, and when you do, what you find is you find this spongy, squashy thing, right, that when you drive it backwards ends up at the Big Bang. Yeah? Now, Einstein hated that idea. Right? So because he hated it so much, he stuck a number into his equations to lock it up. Right? He wanted a static universe. He didn't want one that was moving in and out. So dear old Newton had got to him. Einstein in later life said that was the biggest mistake of his life, to have to fix up something. He developed something absolutely beautiful, which was true, and he kludged it in order to fix it up. Now, it turned out that some years before he got all that stuff together, a man called Edwin Hubble had been studying the light that comes from far distant galaxies. And as he studied that light, what he discovered was the further things were away, the more they were redshifted. Right? This is the Doppler effect. Okay, you know when you're sitting there and waiting for the train to go past on the crossing, as it's coming at you, it's got a higher pitch, and then as it goes away, it gets a lower pitch. All right, this is a frequency shift that's due to the speed of the train, and it's something called a Doppler shift. And it also affects the light that comes off of stars. And so we can tell how fast things are moving away from us by looking at a Doppler shift on these things. And what Hubble discovered was the further things are away from us, the faster they're moving away from us. Right? And when he put that together, he realized the universe was actually expanding. What that meant was the universe expanding. And so then our friend Einstein said, I kludged this. I shouldn't have. My equations were right in the first place. I should have allowed them to be dynamic. And when he put his dynamism in, we discovered this whole notion that everything went back to a singularity, to one infinitesimal point from which everything seemed to come. Now I'll talk about the veracity of that if somebody wants, the truthfulness of that if somebody wants me to, but the basic answer is we've got a theoretical understanding of how fast that thing blew up, and essentially that number that I quoted is the number which is the number we've come to as we watch that thing explode, basically. So it's a theoretical and an empirical estimate. So basically we've sort of put these things together, and it's estimated out of the explosion rate that the universe seems to be following. So is that rough enough? A volume. Yep. Here's the simple way of doing it. See, we have a notion that you've got to have space to expand into, right? So don't even think about that, yeah, because it actually creates its own space as it goes. What's it expanding into? Haven't got a clue. Meaningless question, right? Don't even know, right? What matters here is that this thing is kind of growing in volume, right? And the number I quoted to you is the number it's at this point in time. Okay, so, it wasn't the number it was 1,000,000 years ago. Right? It's not the number we believe it will be in another 1,000,000 years. It's the number it is at this point in time, and it's blowing up like this even as we speak. Right? So, yes.
Is the Earth at the centre?
Yeah, of course, and man and. Sorry, is the Earth at the centre? There is no notion of a central point in the universe, right? And this is what I meant when I said the universe appears to be homogeneous and isotropic. So when you say something is the same, no matter how far you fly out into it, and when it looks the same in every direction, right? Then you put that's an extraordinary statement about the symmetry of the universe. Right? It's a statement that says that the universe basically has no centre. There is no centre. Right? And you say, okay, well, how can this be? Right? What's going on? Well, just think about a current bun. Right? You take this current bun and you load it up with currants, right? And you stick it in the oven. Right? And as you cook it in the oven, it grows. Right? The currents move further away from each other. Right? And yet, at any given time, right, the homogeneity of that bun, even though it's got currents in it, they're there to mark the bun, right? The homogeneity of that bun stays the same. So the answer is there is no, there is no centre in the universe. Right? Now, the next question is, well, what's about this Big Bang thing? Well, that'll be something for you to ponder, because it's all tied up with the notion of geometry, right? And another day, right? Yes. It's the number that, how big is the universe is the question, right? And it was the number I quoted before, which was 46.5 billion light years in radius, right? No, God's an awful lot bigger than that, right? Yeah, well, bigness, you see, in the quantity, in the sense that I answered your question, has nothing to do with spatiality. Right? Okay, because, we've got this, that was what I was trying to get at when I said that, what's this concept of space anyway when we can squash it into nothing? Right? Okay, why are we even worrying about whether God's bigger than that or not? Right? It's a pretty strange question when you come to understand that space just isn't that important. No, because you see, when we say it's inside of Christ, we have a notion of place. Right? And our notion of place isn't a spatial notion. Right? It's like saying home. Home is a place for us to be. Right? So it's a very, very beautiful place to be. It's not saying it is a space, but it's not just a space, is it? It's much more. It's the environment. It's the love. It's the warmth. It's the memories. It's the imagination. So now you see we're talking about place, and when we talk about place, John of Damascus, who was one of the church fathers, had this wonderful notion of place. And he said, Jesus Christ is the place in which God stands in our place. Jesus Christ is the place in which God stands in our place. Now, notice the little interplay between the use of the word place there. Because first of all, there's somewhere or something, but not necessarily spatial, even though I've got my hands working here. There's somewhere or something in which there is a place to be. That is Jesus Christ. Right? But inside that space, we stand, and when we stand inside that space, we stand before the Father in Jesus Christ, who stands in our place. Okay? So this notion of place is not something that is incredibly rich and incredibly deep. And when I get to the end of the second talk, in fact, I'm going to speak a little bit about place. I had to back off at the end of the second talk because I was starting to quote Tom Torrance, and as I started to quote Tom Torrance, I got into this kind of deep and meaningful stuff that Tom gets into. And I got to say, it looked awfully sticky and molasses-like, so I kind of put down a couple of points and then thought I'd get out quick. All right? Not because I think Tom's bad, it's just that he can be a bit deep, and the problem with being a bit deep is that we can miss the wood for the trees. Right? Instead of being able to see this beautiful thing that's associated with place, a place like home. All right, so I don't think. I mean, I think it's extraordinarily. Weak, and it's extraordinarily self-limiting to think about place in terms of space. Extraordinarily limiting. Right? Let me just go sideways here for a minute. Because what about mental places? Right? One of the most powerful things in my life are the mental places, right, in which I live. They're the things out of which I live. Right? I mean, I live in the environments and the social world in which I live, but mostly, eventually it comes back to the loneliness of our own mind. And when we come back to the loneliness of our own mind, it's the mental place in which we live, which is the richest or the poorest place in which we can live. We can be in the cesspit. I mean, I love reading about some of our brothers and sisters who live in places like China and went through some of Mao's stuff. And this wonderful story about this man who used to spend he was a university professor, a bit like me, and he spent his life in those years in which they retrained them in a cesspit. And his job was to shovel out the shit. And as he did so, he was a very happy, rich, and wonderful human being. And why? Because, the place in which he lived had something to do with what he was immersed in physically, but mostly it had to do with where he lived out of the riches and the depth of his own humanity. It was the mental place that mattered, not the spatial place. All right? Now, I don't want to diminish space. It's too much. But all right, we probably need to wrap up there. But thank you very much for your questions. They were very good, and I hope I gave some answers to them. So, all right, guys. Looks like Raylene and others have got a wonderful-looking supper back there, so I at least would like to participate in that. Okay, thank you, guys. Bye-bye. A few hundred years now, and it's our friend Karl that kicked all that off 100 years ago. Okay, now why attempt to do theological science? Right? And I've been into a number of homes where typically the husband and I were discussing these deep and meaningfuls in relation to theological science, and the wife could be heard to say, well, that's all very well for you boys to get into that kind of stuff. But look, I'm just getting on with the practical things of life and doing the things that God wants me to do. So the question is it not enough to hear the Word of God participate in a church and do good deeds. Right? You know, isn't that what the Christian life's all about? We just get into that, and once we're into that, that's all we need to have. So, you know, to hell with this theological science stuff, and you know, we just get on with life. My answer is yes. I mean, these things, it is enough to do these things, rightly interpreted. But I've just got a couple of questions. One of those is, you know, what is the Word of God? Okay? I mean, it's taken as obvious, I think, in that first thing. It's not so obvious to me. I've been at it for 30 years, and I'm probably a bit slow. All right? But it's, you know, it's one of those things. What is the church? Right? I mean, it's a really interesting question. I had the privilege of leading an eldership retreat for a church I've been involved in for about 30 years. And it was very obvious to me that after I'd been leading that retreat for a while, that I was in the minority in relation to how I understood the church. Right? Because I had an understanding of the church as Jesus Christ. Right? That's my understanding of the church. But it certainly wasn't the understanding of the eldership, and so it made for a very interesting time. What a good deed! I mean, I love that word "good." You know, Jesus had a really nice thing to say about it, didn't he? Why do you call me good? Only God is good. So yeah, I'm into good deeds, but Jesus done them for me, and I'm really wrapped in that idea. Because, hey, I don't seem to do very well myself. Now, here's this thing about misrepresentation of God. This is Paul, right? So, for if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is vain. Right? Now, I went to Theological college, and I've got to say, 95% of what I was told there was that Jesus had risen in our minds, but not necessarily in reality. Paul says, hey, if that's what we're saying, and that's what we claim, we are misrepresenting God. Our faith is in vain. We're dead meat. If Jesus is not risen, forget it. But more than that, the thing that worries me is this notion that we might misrepresent God. Because it flags to us the possibility that we can misrepresent God. I mean, you know, some people think it's just that easy. You get out there, you tell the good news, and misrepresent God. In misrepresenting God, we may turn good news into bad news. And I've got to say, awful lot of preachers who this phrase that I've just put in here applies to. Right? There's a special place in hell for those of us who speak falsely about God. Okay? Let me tell you a story. Okay? Let me tell you a story. There's this man who went off to a town, and it was winter because he couldn't afford to go in high season, so he went in low season and stayed in this town in the winter time. And he got there in the hotel and unpacked and went down to the sitting room to sit near the fire. But unfortunately, there was a ministers' conference there at the time. And they were all sitting around the fire talking about things that ministers do. You know, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and how do you increase the numbers in the church, and all those good things. Right? And anyway, he said, "Excuse me, can I get near the fire?" And they just ignored him, right, because they were deep and meaningful. And so he said, "Excuse me, can I get near the fire?" But it didn't work either. So he thought, I'll go for a walk. So out he went, walked through the parks and stuff, and just got warm by having some exercise. He thought, I know, I'll get up really early tomorrow morning, I'll get flashed down there, and I'll sit in front of the fire. Got up really early in the morning, but they were still there. They'd been there all night. So wasn't doing any good. And so he went off for another walk in the park, saw a couple of museums and various other things. And then that night, as he was laying in bed, unable to sleep, he had this flash of insight. So the following day, he went down and he said, excuse me, last night I dreamt I was in hell. And they said, well, really, what was it like? And he said, well, pretty much like it is here. I couldn't get near the fire for all the ministers. I include myself as one of them. So another night we'll have a talk on 4 modern notions of hell, just to clean up what I was thinking about there. Taking care. In theology, we try to be careful about hearing God's word to us. It's this notion of carefulness that I believe tends theology towards the category of human activity we call science. So some people during the break asked me this question about science and certainty and various other things, and I've got to say it's been 100 years since we had a notion that science had anything to do with certainty. Right? Even that great queen of the sciences, mathematics, is no longer considered to have an activity which is associated with certainty. All right? Kurt Gödel put an end to all that. He wrote a famous paper in which he proved that not all things are provable. Right? Okay? Now you can ask me about that one later, and I'll bore you to tears on the topic. All right? But it turns out that it's actually true, and it has some enormous implications for decision making and modern computer science. Okay, now I'm going to quote my friend Karl here. Theology is one among those human undertakings traditionally described as sciences. Not only the natural sciences are sciences, humanistic sciences also seek to apprehend a specific object and its environment in a manner which is directed by the phenomenon itself. Now you might find that a bit different from what you learnt in Year 8, if you were like me. In Year 8 I was taught you observe, you hypothesise, you build a law and then you prove your law. Well, I've got to say I didn't like it then, and I like it even less today, having spent 30 odd years in science. Paul Dirac was my great friend. He said, if one has an intuitive feeling of where you think you're going, an eye for beauty in your equations, he was a physicist, an eye for beauty in your equations, then you're pretty sure to be on the right track. I said, yep, I'm in. I can do science. Okay, so what happens with these humanistic sciences is they seek to understand something on its own terms, not by taking an alien framework and crushing it in on top of what we're trying to observe, right? But rather getting to know, indwelling and dwelling with something, and in doing that being able to understand it well enough to be able to speak about it, and speak about it in ways which are appropriate to it. Now, Trish, you need to help me here. Who was the mythological guy that had the bed, if they went long enough? Procrustes, was that him? Yeah, okay. Here's this guy Procrustes, right, out of classical mythology. Trish is a classicist. So, when he had visitors, he used to feed them up, and then if they were too long for one bed he used to cut their toes and heads off, right? And another one, if they were too short for another bed, he'd put them on the rack and he'd stretch them to fit, right? I've got to say, an awful lot of theology looks just like that. Right? An awful lot of theology looks just like that. What you do is you come in with this notion of knowledge, which is some phenomenal thing about human beings who are omniscient about everything, and in that omniscience about everything, they have this general idea about what religion is. So you do comparative religion, right? You compare Christianity with that religion and some other religion. You have a history of religions. You have this general notion of religions, and out of that, you study this object called Christian religion, right? Well, I've got to say, the very foundations of that way of thinking are actually false. Right? And yet, boy, do I say this? Yeah, my kids went to a school where that reigns supreme. And Bruce knows he had his kids there as well. All right, so the word theology seems to signify a very special science whose task is to apprehend and speak of God. All right, so there's our friend Karl. Now, I've got to back off here for a sec and say that Karl also said it's both too great and too small an honour to call theology science. Okay, I'll let you ponder what that means. All right, it's both too great and too small an honour, and yet I'm quoting the book that he wrote just before he died here, Right? Now, he actually meant something by what he said with that last phrase too. Okay, so here's our friend Sherlock, that wonderful sleuth of the imagination and story. And I'm trying to use him to underline something. And that is what I want to say in a minute is really, 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 really important. Okay? Really important. Take time to consider the smallest point, maybe the most essential. In natural science, we study a given. An ant, some kind of microbe, an atom. It's something that's given to us, and we as human beings stand above it, perhaps, and we observe it, and it's in our control to some extent. But in theological science, we study a giver. And our centre is not in ourselves, but in God. Right? So the two kinds of... They're sciences. They're both sciences, and they both have that common thing about studying an object in the way which is appropriate to it, determined by it, and in the language which is appropriate to it. So that's true. But they're actually studying extraordinarily different things. I mean, that might come as a surprise. I mean, God's a bit bigger than atoms, right? He kind of is bigger, right? In whatever we mean by the word bigger, not spatial. But the thing is, he's this guy who tells stories, right? So God's somebody who told stories, and I think even tells stories today. He's a giver. He's not a given. Right? If he doesn't give himself to us, we don't get him. Right? It's like having another human being. If Trish doesn't give herself to me, she's not my wife, is she? It's the time in which she gives herself to me that she's my wife. I can't demand that she gives herself to me any more than she can demand I give myself to her. I tell a story against myself. When we lived in the States in the 80s, Trish bought this wonderful T-shirt which said, "I was meant to be loved, not understood." And again, I'm a slow learner. I've realised that it's not possible to understand her, but I'm still working on being able to love her, which is a work in progress. But nevertheless, it's my problem, not hers. Well, maybe. Okay. But here's another interesting thing. God gives himself to us, but he doesn't give himself away. Doesn't give himself into our control. Right? Jesus didn't give himself to them because he knew what was in their hearts. Yeah? Okay, so God gives himself to us, and the God who gives himself to us is a real God. That real God. He is God, but he doesn't give himself away. Right? I mean, we're so wired. We like to use things and get them in our control, but good luck with God. Okay, now I want to start to focus on the incarnation, because the incarnation is the point in which we really come to understand who God is. Right? And in the incarnation, God is revealed to us in space and time. He comes as a real man, real flesh, sinful flesh, our flesh, and he lives on this earth. Lives a few years, gets knocked off by the Romans and the Jews, and dies. Yet, and I mean, here's the staggering thing. We have this debate about whether Jesus rose again or not, right? But I mean, once you've worked out the incarnation, the resurrection's a piece of cake, right? Because here's this man walking around in flesh and blood on the earth, but he doesn't cease to be eternal. He doesn't cease to be the God he always was. He doesn't cease to be the one who created the world, upholds it by the strength of his own power. He doesn't cease to be any of those things. He still is all of those things, and yet he's a man, a real man. Staggering stuff. Staggering stuff. It's the great miracle to me. The rest of it just flows... I mean, look, the resurrection's a great miracle, but it flows out of this miracle. And so in Jesus we see the Father and the Son revealed, and we see the beauty of their relationship, the winsomeness, the loveliness, the beauty of that relationship in which they draw us into. And but something else is going on. Right? In Jesus, we see the creator of the world inside the creation, recreating the world from the inside out. Right? He's sitting inside it. What's he doing? Hanging around in Judea? Yeah, sure. Yeah. But he's actually recreating the world from inside the world. He's sitting in there non-violently, beautifully, powerfully, lovingly, strongly, inexorably recreating all that he's created. He's not working on plan B. He's working on plan A. And plan A is going very well. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, as modern people, we used to keep the natural and the supernatural apart. Now, this all gets traced back to René Descartes. Whether we should blame him or not is another question, but nevertheless, he's a suitable figure to blame in history because certainly he had something to do with this. He was embraced by the church because what the church managed to do with René Descartes was give the physical part to science and the spiritual part to the church, because there was a bit of a fight going on at René's time about who got the power with respect to all of these things. And René managed to rip them apart in a fantastic theory, and he's an extraordinarily bright guy. And we've been reaping the repercussions of it since. And Baxter Kruger, who some of us know, wrote a beautiful paper on the fact that René was just Augustine's stepchild, really. All right, he might have got the blame for it, but Augustine set it all up in the first place, and after Augustine it was all downhill, and René just worked out which way the ball was rolling. Okay, so we don't pull the supernatural and the natural apart. That's not what we should do. But when we put them back together, the trouble is we don't feel comfortable with it. Right? Now, C.S. Lewis, in his science fiction book, Voyage to Venus, which I think is the third in that trilogy, has this guy who walks out of the town out of Oxford, and he's walking across to this house. And as he walks across there, he gets some kind of sense of the numinous, right? And he says, what was going on? Why was I so uncomfortable? And he says, well, what happened was the distinction between natural and supernatural, in fact, broke down. And when it had done so, one realised how great a comfort it had been. How it eased the burden of intolerable strangeness, which this universe imposes on us by dividing it into two halves and encouraging the mind never to think of both at the same time. Roll into the front door of the church, do your churchy bit, and say, I've done that, I'm out, great, let's get on with the rest of life. And, hey, boy. Okay, now, Lutheranism, and from it, modern Protestantism, right, has this dualism between space-time, right, and God. Okay, now, there are other places, but interestingly enough, it doesn't exist inside Orthodoxy. Tricia, my older daughter, is Orthodox these days, and we're partly to blame because we got into this Trinity stuff, and Orthodoxy is really into that. So, but Orthodoxy doesn't have this separation. The Anglican Church, in its original form, doesn't have this separation. Presbyterianism or the Reformed Church doesn't have this separation. But modern Protestantism does. And why does it? Well, it kicks off with Lutheranism, the wrought sets in with Luther, and it all rolls down with Descartes up its back. It all rolls down to the Protestant theology we have today, in which these two things are torn apart, right? And we've got this kind of receptacle notion. You know, I liken Luther to thinking of God sitting up there with a can of tea, right? So the world's inside the tea can, and he kind of got to lift the lid off, right, and poke the sun in. Well, no, leave the lid off, I suppose, while the sun's poked in order to get Jesus in there, right? And look, another night, somebody more learned than I can discuss what influence this has on Luther's notion of the Lord's Supper and all kinds of other things, right? It has tremendous influence on it, and it causes a very, very sick theology. Now, not all of Lutheran theology is sick. Some of it's quite good. Okay, now Tom Torrance unpacks this very beautifully in Space, Time and Incarnation. So if you want to read about this stuff, I think it's about the second chapter of his book, Space, Time and Incarnation. He unpacks this Lutheran stuff extremely well. Now, one of the things about Tom Torrance is that Tom did not shrink from this intolerable strangeness that's associated with bringing the natural and the supernatural together. Tom embraced it, and in fact, Tom saw his life's purpose. Tom saw his life's purpose as evangelising the academy, evangelising the thought flows, the stories of our society, and in evangelising the foundation of those stories to so change the way in which the academy thinks, right? I mean, here's a simple statement which I think is a reasonable statement. Look at where philosophy is at today, and you'll see what the people on the street will be saying in 50 years' time. Right? That's a pretty reasonable statement in my experience, and history bears that out. When if you think seriously about what you're doing, right, it's important to be in the grassroots of a church, out building the playgrounds for the kids, and producing the cups of tea and things that make a church up. It's important to do those things. But it is just as important, in fact perhaps even more important, to change the stories by which our society tries to live by. Much, 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 much more important. All right? And boy, if you didn't see a little bit of anger in me there, you should have. Because I'm actually furious about the slackness and the way in which people don't realise how important that task is. Anyway, Tom realised how important it was, and he spent his lifetime working on it. Now, Tom can be a bit like molasses, so live with me here a bit. I've tried to break him up a bit, and I've also tried to give you some idea of where he goes, and I've tried to paraphrase him a bit. All right? So remember that theology is God-centred, so Tom starts here in a God-centred way. Right? God creates out of his freedom to do so. Guess what? He's big enough. He can create. So he does. He endows the universe with rationality, right? Because he wanted to, and he makes it knowable. In his creative process, though, God doesn't link himself into it somehow where he's trapped. He does it in a way in which he's completely free. So the universe is created in a contingent way. It depends upon him. Right? But he's not trapped by it. He gives it, but he doesn't give himself away into it. Right? He's still God. He's still free. It follows from this that God cannot be known from the determinations of the universe. Now, those of you who are theologically trained know that what I'm saying there, or what Tom is saying there, is natural theology, as it's traditionally known, is a whole lot of bunkum. Right? Natural theology says you can find your way to God by studying the universe. That's a bit like saying you can look at a painting and work out who the painter is. Okay? That is, understand the painter. I don't mean, it's Van Gogh or Cézanne or whatever. I mean, you work out who the guy is. Well, hey, that's pretty good. Bruce got a couple of good stories on that, but I don't think we'll tell them here, will we, Bruce? Okay, the universe is contingent but also free, and hence can be known in itself and from itself. Okay, so it's not a bad thing to do science, natural science. When we understand in a godly way the universe is to be seen as upheld by God, right? Okay, so we understand the universe in a godly way, then we see it as upheld by God, who in his freedom exists within it. So he comes down in the incarnation, exists within it. And when he's in it, now get this phrase, when he's in it, he realises it. Okay? So in other words, he doesn't just come into the world and nothing happens. Right? When he comes into the world and he lives inside the world, he actually makes it what it really is. He makes the world what it really is by living in it. Okay? Now, that's a talk for about a month. Right? Okay? So he changes the world into what it is he wants it to be. Yeah? That's what happens when he comes down in the incarnation. It's a hell of a thing. Yeah? You want to know a bit more about that, ask me afterwards. Okay, so now as I said to you before, I've got these little flags down the bottom. Right? Tom argues in spirals. Right? So Tom, remember this thing about circularity? Okay, so Tom argues in these spirals, and as the spirals go down, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. All right? So what he's going to do here is he's going to flick across to a man view. Right? So he's sort of set it up so that we've got some understanding about creation. And then he's going to say, hey, what happens if I'm a man and I have a look at this stuff? We can know the world to the extent that our investigations will allow us. So there we are, Newton understood the world to a certain extent, Einstein understood it to a certain extent. One of the big problems we've got today is we've got this thing called quantum mechanics floating around, we've got this thing called general relativity floating around, we can't put them together. Okay? It's been a frustration of physicists for the last 30 years, and my generation of physicists just feel like we're failures because we feel like we haven't made any contributions in that area in our lifetimes. So, but it is hard. It's unbelievably hard. Okay. But when we investigate the world out of the way the world itself is, right, at most we say things about God which are ambiguous. Right? We don't say things that are very certain about God. We say things about God which are ambiguous. Right? They point beyond themselves, right? So they point out and point away, but they don't actually point at God. And the failure of these investigations into the world to give an account of the world, right, one of the big problems with modern science and modern culture is we can't actually give an account of the world. We can't explain it. We can explain some things about it, but we don't give a very good account of what the world is, really. And that's one of the reasons we have problems ethically. Okay, now notice what our friend Tom is, when that word obverse, which is the backside of, the opposite to, right? What Tom wants to say here is, well look, hey, it didn't work very well, okay? And so this is obverse to the fact, because that was man's view, it's obverse to the fact that now we're going to go back and look at God. It's obverse to the fact that the rational connection between creation and God can only be established and grounded in God alone. Now remember, the spiral gets harder and harder. So if you think this is starting to get a bit deep, it is. But if you can hang in there, try and hang in there. It's always worth it. With Tom, he'll never disappoint you, in my experience. All right? So the rational connection between creation and God can be established and grounded in God alone. What do we mean? Well, let's take Athanasius. All right? It is both more godly and more true to know God as Father through Jesus Christ than it is to know Him as the uncreated Creator. That's what we mean. Right? We mean if you want to know who God is, you've got to look at Jesus. Right? It's that simple. Right? So the rational connection, where does that get made? It gets made in Jesus. It gets made in the incarnation. But that's the only place it gets made. And to look for it elsewhere is a waste of time. Now, it gets even harder. Indeed, the rationality of the universe is obtained through God's comprehension of it. All right? Now, if you don't get that one tonight, don't worry about it. All right? But you see, it's God's idea. The universe is God's idea. And the reason it's rational is because God made it that way. All right? So it's what God thinks about it that matters. Right? That's why we can trust God. That's why we can trust Him for our lives. That's why we can trust Him when we look at something like Haiti and we watch those beautiful people crushed under all those rocks. It's the Tower of Siloam thing all over again. Were they more sinful than us? No. Right? Jesus is not surprised by Haiti. He's not surprised by Haiti. Right? It's that kind of world that we live in. How do you work all that out? I don't know. But I've got to say, our Christianity isn't ice creams and cordial and Sunday school picnics down by the beach. It's those things, yes. But it's just not those things. Right? It's boys and girls torn apart in the rubble of hating. But nevertheless, in spite of all that, the universe is a rational place. And it obtains its rationality in the comprehension of God about it. And that's why we can trust God that we are His children and that we have been adopted into His family. Because He's about it, and boy, I feel a lot relieved as a result of that. So anyway, it's in this comprehension that the basis and the medium of God's revelation to us, the way He speaks to us, takes place in the incarnation. Now, let me just try and explain that last bit. What Tom's trying to do there is he's trying to deal with a theory of knowledge. He's trying to say the way in which we can know about God is because God makes the way for us to know about him. It's the Holy Spirit in one sense. Right? The Holy Spirit provides us with the means by which we know who Jesus is in the incarnation. Karl Barth said, the incarnation can be understood as the crater which is left behind by a bomb. That's the best we can understand it from a human point of view. We see the crater, the bomb goes off, and all we can see is the crater. If you want to see what was actually in there, then that's God's job. God reveals himself as the one who made the crater. All right? So this is a story about knowledge, and it's technical, and it's got a whole place another night. Now, Torrance, building on the work of Karl Barth and Church Fathers and Albert Einstein and James Clark, has positioned us beautifully. Right? I mean, we are in a magnificent place, a very exciting place today, to undertake the next stage of theology, in which the stories of the natural and the supernatural are knitted into one. Right? It's one of the great privileges that we've got, and one which I hope that at least some of us will take up. Okay, and we're poised on the threshold of that. And people like Baxter are excited by this. I'm excited by this. Right? Because we actually stand in a place which I believe we've never stood in the 2,000 years since Jesus Christ. We actually stand in a place where these two things might actually go together. I don't think there's a time like that since the Church Fathers. Church Fathers put a whole lot of this stuff together, and in fact, they're well worth a read. Right? Those guys 1,500 years ago knew more than a lot of us know today. They really did. And I quoted John of Damascus to a question down here before, and boy, he was a smart guy. Okay. All right. Now, I've sort of been talking technically. Now I just want to talk existentially, if you like, about us. So what? What's in it for me? And they're okay questions. Not the only questions, but they're okay questions. Point one, it is God who is the way in which we go. I am the way, the truth, and the life. It is God who is the way in which we go. That takes an awful lot of stress and strain off, guys, because it's him that guarantees our future. Right? But he doesn't just want us to sit back and slide down the hill. He wants us to join him out of freedom, out of our own freedom, the freedom he's given us. He wants us to join him and participate with him in what he's about. And he's equipped us with absolutely wonderful things to do that. Now, this is partly why I was armed on this question of place before. Tom has about 3 really good suggestions about where we might go in relation to putting together natural science and theological science. Right? And one of those is that John of Damascus, right, has this notion of analogy. An analogy is, you talk about something over here, and it's being used to describe something over there. And if you want an example of that, we talk about earthly things and try to describe God with them. Well, how rational is that, and how good is that? Is an interesting question. Right? How can we use an analogy from our human experience to talk about God? And the answer is pretty good. Why? Because God makes it good. That's why. All right? And so here's a good question. How does Christ's godliness operate with his humanity? Well, that's a pretty good question, and well worth a few PhDs. Okay, because the interesting thing is, while he's incarnate in a physical space and body, right, he hasn't left the bosom of the Father. Right? Jesus is still in the bosom of the Father, even though he's suffering on the cross. He's still in the bosom of the Father. Now, I didn't get taught that in theological college, I might say. I mean, I taught a lot of other stuff, which didn't seem all that important. Okay, so the interesting thing is he becomes a man, but he's a very special man. And he doesn't leave the bosom of the Father. And while he truly becomes flesh, flesh of flesh, flesh of our flesh, he still remains God of God. Right? Fully God and fully man. So he doesn't abandon his own immateriality. Right? And there's some really good research to do on that, and there's some really good stories to be told about that. And the more we can tell those stories, the more that we will have an influence on the society in which we live. Now, Tom was pretty down in the mouth about biology, and I think he's right. I've spent the last few years working in psychology and neuroscience, and one of the ideas Tom had was that we should start to use field theories. Now, it turned out I got into the notion of field theory before I read F Torrance on this topic, and what was driving me was the question of how you describe the brain, which has got 3 trillion neurons in it, and each of those is connected to somewhere between 3 and 10,000 other neurons. You think in a computer, hey, I've got a lot of connections, 10. I don't know, David, how many? 20? So, the gates connector fanned out to 10 other things. Right? Well, the brain fans out to somewhere between 3 and 10,000. And that's a lot. And one of the things it's done is it's stopped us from really simulating the brain too much on a computer, because it's hard. Right? And when I was in the States in the mid-'80s, I got to know a guy called Terry Stanowski, who was at Johns Hopkins at the time. And Terry was trying to build these kinds of models of the brain where you wire everything up and look at it, and did some beautiful work. But it gets hard. It gets hard awfully quick, because when you're trying to take 3 trillion things and connect each one of those to 10,000 other things, it gets really complicated. Okay? And I've never felt that strong, so I kind of wanted to see a way to do that a bit more easily. And the analogy is that in solids we talk about acoustics, we talk about sound in a solid, and what that is, it's the vibration of trillions of nuclei. And the interesting thing is that we often describe those as fields. Right? And so the idea here was that maybe that's a way to do this, and it turns out it works quite well. And then lo and behold, I start reading Tom, who drags all this stuff out of his theology, and Tom says, gee, it'd be a real good idea if we could apply these notions of field theories to biology. I think he's right, and that's a discussion for another night. But again, isn't it interesting that this man who spent his life as a theologian comes out and says, hey, I think I know how science ought to go about its business. So maybe at that point in time you start to say, well, maybe this discussion he's got about putting together theological science and natural science together might not be as crackpot as we think it is. Okay, as I said, in my case it was about trying to do something easily because I don't know how to do it any better. And that reminds me of another story, which is about, a physicist is like a drunk who looks for his keys in the light of the lamp post, right? And the reason he does is he can't find them anywhere else. Okay, yeah. Okay, Tom also has this, Tom doesn't lack in ambition, right? And Tom says, well, hey, one of the problems we've got is that history and theology aren't put together, right? Read all this stuff on higher criticism and literary criticism and redactionism. It's all good stuff, by the way. I've got no problem with literary criticism or redaction criticism in principle. As historical sciences, they're good things, and they help us understand the Scripture in ways which I think are useful. But the problem I had at the time when I learnt about them was that you want to put it all back together. Right? You pull all this stuff apart with these wonderful tools, but there weren't any tools to put it all back together. Right? So you got it all in pieces. And hey, my brother was really good. He'd get his bike on Christmas, and he had it apart by New Year's Day. But it took Dad a month to put the damn thing back together. So hey, we got to do better than just being able to do historical analysis. You know? And Tom makes the point, the historical doctrine of the resurrection cannot do without its correlate in the empty tomb. Right? You've got to have the history. Without the history, without the reality of Jesus Christ in history, then the message that comes down from God is not the message that we've received from God. And so trying to put history and theology together is not a nicety that we might do because we want to one day. It's a necessity. It's an absolute necessity. And I've poked in this notion of physics because John Searle, who's a philosopher who lives in the US, John Searle's had this idea of how do you speak about electrons and qualia. Qualia are how we observe and feel about the world, colours, sounds, they're qualia, qualities. And he says, how do you build a common theory of electrons and qualia? Right? How do you put together a theoretical story about the world in which these things exist side by side and in relation to each other? How do you do that? Right? Because as you start to do that, then you speak wholly about the world, and as you speak wholly about the world, you speak healthily about the world. You don't have it torn apart. You have it together, distinct, observable in all its distinction, but unified as a whole in the beauty of its unification. And so I think Tom's idea here is a really good idea too. So some pretty amazing things lie before us, and possibilities exist for us in relation to understanding the way the world is, the stories we have to tell about the world both theologically and in terms of natural science, and Tom's right to point those out to us. But I want to end by saying three things remain: faith, hope and love. Faith in what? God. Hope in who? God. Love of God. These are the things that remain. Right? Not some, fantastic qualities that stand on their own, but faith in God, hope in God, and the love of God. And we're inheritors of magnificent heritage. Right? We stand in the flow of the church fathers, of people like Athanasius, of modern people like Barth and Torrance. We stand in the flow of all those things as the great saints. One of the things I love about going to Kiri's church, Kiri's our elder daughter, one of the things I love about going to the Orthodox church is as I sit there, around me are the saints on the walls. Right? They remind me that my congregation is not just the human beings that are sitting inside the church. My congregation is the congregation of God's saints down through the ages. Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. I am not the God of the dead, I am the God of the living. Okay? I am the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. So we have the great privilege of carrying on a conversation with John of Damascus and Gregory of Nazianzen. And that all comes down to us. That's part of the richness that we inherit. But more than that, of course, we inherit a faith in Jesus Christ and all that he's done for us. We have a fantastic hope because God has assured us of that hope by what he did in Jesus Christ. But more than that, he doesn't call us to be placid about it. He calls us to actively engage in what he's about. To actively engage in what he's about. We might say, I don't want to do that. Whatever it is he's got in front of you at the moment, which might not be very nice. Right? And you say, I don't want to do that. Well, hey, maybe it's bigger than we think. Maybe it's bigger than we think. And then there's this love. One of God's great acts of love to us is that he told us stories. When we read the Gospels, we want to value them and honour them very, very highly. Because they're the stories that God has told us. Right? Now those stories go back through the history of Israel. God tells stories to us. What an incredible thing. What a fatherly thing. What a thing that a brother and a friend would do. That they would tell you stories that are stories to live by, stories which cast light onto our world and which give us hope. I want to say one of the great acts of love that is open to us is to develop the true stories for our age. Part of that is to listen to people like Baxter and others, to be able to hear those stories, and part of that is to be able to be creative, to talk about those stories ourselves. Right? Some people are poets, some people are writers, some people make really nice cakes. There are many, many ways in which people can tell the story about God's love. Mums and dads can tell the story about God's love. They're great stories to tell, And one of the wonderful things, I think, is that one of the great privileges is that as a scientist in nature and theology, one of the great privileges and one of the great callings is to tell true stories about our age. Okay, so that's it. Are there any questions? Oh, yes, sorry. What is field theory? Tough question. What is a field? Perhaps might be an easy place to start. Right. And the answer is a field is a quantity. Now here's where I get slammed. A field is a quantity that is associated with every point in a space. Okay? So when we normally do mechanics, we often think of the moon as a particle, single point. Right? Why? Because it's too hard to do it any other way. And we just think about these little points which are just somewhere in space moving around. Right? What we do in field theory is we think of points at everywhere in space, and they all move together. Right? So it's a very, very large quantity. Now, why did James Clerk Maxwell even think about that? Right? Well, he thought about it because Michael Faraday thought about it before him. And Faraday was inspired by the fact, I don't know if you've ever done, there's a neat little experiment where you take a bar magnet, put a sheet of paper over the top of it, and you shake iron filings onto it. Okay? And they fill these patterns. You know, those patterns form lines that permeate all around that magnet. They're indications of a field. That field, that magnetic field, exists everywhere in space. Everywhere in space. Not just around the magnet. It goes out to the 46.5 billion light years that we were talking about before. So a field is something that extends throughout space. And when Maxwell started to work that out, he fixed up something that was really wrong with Newton's theory, which I didn't even talk about. Newton couldn't explain why the moon stayed in orbit around the Earth. He said it had something to do with gravity, and he was able to recognise that the gravity that he was talking about the moon was the same as made an apple fall on the Earth. It was the same thing. But people talked about action at a distance. They said somehow magically it got out there. In fact, there was a number of people who said, well, it's God. God does it, right? He kind of fixes it all up, right? And so a very famous quote from Simon Laplace, who said, God, I have no need of that hypothesis in my theory. Now what did he mean? He meant, hey, I can do a mechanics where I don't have to put God in. Right? He wasn't actually denigrating God. He was just saying, don't be stupid. Right? If you write down a mathematical theory, you ought to write down a decent one. Now, what happened with fields is the field permeates out into all space. So how does the moon move in relation to the Earth? It moves because it moves in the field of the Earth, which permeates all through space. And this is how all things are connected. So the Earth forms the centre of that field, and that's a true centre, so it's distinct. And the moon forms a centre of its own field, so that's distinct. But they both permeate throughout all space, so they're actually unified in a single unified quantity. So fields are very, very powerful ideas. So I don't know, how did I go? Rough, a bit of a sketch? Wave the hands. Any other questions? Still not looking. Oh, hello, yes. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you've got all these different vibrations all the way through. And if God is actually the one holding it all together and in everything,
Mm-hmm.
what's really God? Like,
Well, one thing God isn't is all of the things you just described.
if that energy is actually a God that's
It's of God. It's of God. But because something is of God, it doesn't make him God. You see, I mean, this is something called pantheism. Right? If, you see, God made this chair, and he made it in such a way that he actually likes me to sit on it. Right? But I don't have to... Yeah, God made the man who made the chair, right? But I don't have to apologise to God for sitting on him. So the thing is, he upholds the world, right? But he's distinct from the world. You see, well, most of what holds this chair together is electromagnetism. Right? So there are electromagnetic fields that hold the atoms inside this chair together. No. It's got God created, that's right. Well, it means that he created it, and that he goes on creating it, right? And that in going on and creating it, he upholds it, right? So, yes? Yep. That's right. It's the work of God, yeah. It's not God. You see, I mean, to identify... The problem here is, I think, is that it's whether we choose to see the painting that somebody painted, and then, because of the effect of, I don't know, flash photography or something, needs to come back and paint to continue to keep it in its pristine form, right? The painting isn't the painter. Right? It's a form that owes its existence to the painter, and owes, in this case, and it's a bad analogy because, it's the best I can do. It owes its existence to the painter. It's a bit like our house, right? We built it 20 years ago, and I lost the argument on whether we should have stained wooden windows or not, right? And so, if I don't get back in there and restain those windows, then they don't remain stained, right? The timber starts to rot. So the question is, they're upheld in the quality that they have by the fact that I uphold them by doing something. Yeah? So God upholds the creation, he makes it, and he keeps it in place. Right? Therefore it's dependent upon him. And that's what we mean when we say it's contingent. Yeah? Okay, so it's dependent upon him for its existence. You and I exist because God allows us to, in fact, acts in such a way as to cause us to. That's why we exist. But he creates us in such a way as to be free. Right? So we can act and move and live and have our being in freedom. Yeah? But, right, that freedom is dependent upon another who is different from you and different from me. Right? They aren't us. God isn't us. Yeah? Yeah. So, yeah. True. Have I just explained the meaning of field? What? Well, tell me some more, Trevor. I'm not sure I'm following you. Yes. Yeah. Very good. Very good. No, you're exactly right, Trevor. And in fact, there's some very beautiful work. Even my mate John of Damascus, in fact, did some very beautiful work on this. Tom Torrance picks it up in his in that book on space, time, and incarnation, and makes something of this notion of field. I mean, your questions are quite superb, absolutely superb, because you have your finger on something really, really important here. Let me just read something which I wasn't planning to read, but I wrote this essay a few months ago, and it was about Tom's book, Space, Time and Incarnation. And the section I want to read here is called The Concepts of Place and Field. Torrance next starts working out an insight about the notion of place. Right, in the Greek word that is topos. In doing so, he explores an analogy between the abstract mathematical language of topology, right, in which we explore the fundamental similarities and differences that exist between the spaces that underlie our geometry and theories of functions. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that a cup has the same topology as a donut. Right? So if you grab the cup and you can distort the space that the cup is, you can actually distort it into a donut. Why? Because there's a hole where you put your finger to hold the cup. Yeah? And there's a hole through a donut. Okay? And what makes the difference between, at this very, very fundamental level, what makes the difference between geometries is whether they have holes in them or not. All right? And another day, those of you who want to get into the subject of topology can do so. All right. Torrance was a brilliant mathematician. I don't know if you know that. But do you know what? Does anybody want to tell me this? He was a famous member of a mathematical society, which I can't remember the name of. Anyway. Torrance believes that a similar abstraction is at work, and it's helpful in the work of the Fathers with their notion of physical topos and divine topos. Physical space, physical place, and divine place. In a very deep analogy, John of Damascus speaks about the mental place, topos nomos. To speak of a place in which energy, is not observed that stands in correspondence to a space where energy is observed. So think of those vibrations as energy. Right? Now, I don't want to get into, there are all kinds of strange ideas about vibrations, right, which I don't want to get into, but I take your point because, people are into string theory, which I'm not really into. I think it's got all kinds of flaws, but people into string theory tell you that the most elementary particles in the universe are vibrations of strings. All right, so. And does the universe sing? Yes, it does. And hey, but there's some really good stuff in there, and there's some really crappy stuff in there as well. Yeah. All right. So we're going to think about a mental space in which there's no energy, and we're going to think about a physical space in which there is energy, and these two lie in correspondence to each other. That's how the brain works, if you like. And my comment here is that given that we now believe that mental processes do use energy, it's probably helpful to restate John of Damascus' thinking in terms of the concept of intentionality. Intentionality is a philosophic term, by which it means the aboutness of the mind. So, one of the strange things about human beings is we actually think about things. Right? We actually are directed towards the world. We actually observe the world and we participate in it and we change it, right, by the things we do. And that's something that's coded as a term called intentionality in philosophy. Now, somehow, without being the same as the thing you observe, and inferred, the thing you're thinking about, the mind can grasp these things without being it. This is the thing about being place. Yeah? It's a mental place. Right? So the mind can lay hold, just like I can grab this chair by grasping it, and minds can lay hold of something about the world. Yeah? And as we lay hold of the world, we can grasp it mentally. But without... Sorry? Yeah. An analogy of being. Right? Okay, we're built that way. Somehow we're built to be able to grasp the world. Somehow we're built to be able to take up its rationality. All right. And so we can grasp it without being it. All right? So we don't have to be something. God doesn't have to be the world without being able to hang on to it and make it do things. In doing so, the mind has its own place. Notice what happened with place here. It's not a space anymore in the sense of physical space. It's a place. The mind has its own place that is in correspondence with the space it is directed towards, or the thing it's directed towards, but it's not that thing. It's not that place. Okay? It's amazing stuff. It's not that place. This mental space operates beyond the limitations of the physical. I mean, when I dream at night, All kinds of things happen that could never happen in the physical world that I know of. Right? So this mental space is a pretty amazing space. In a minute, Adrian, or do you want to?
Is that like understanding a concept without actually being the concept?
Indeed. Yep. Okay. So it operates beyond the limitations of physics. Yep. We can run faster than the speed of light. I could have hair. Okay. Now, John of Damascus uses this beautiful analogy to richly understand how Christ's godliness operates with his humanity. Here's a quote. While he became incarnate in the physical space of the body he assumed, Christ was not confined or circumscribed by it. He thus became man without leaving the bosom of the Father, and while he became flesh, he did not abandon his own immateriality. So you can see where one of my quotes came from up there. Okay, now here's the field bit. Thus we're starting to build, now if you want to go home anybody, please do so. Thus we're starting to build a deeper understanding of what we mean when we speak of states that are meaningfully coordinated with each other but are not proportionate, in some cases not even observable. Right? Now I did my PhD in the scattering theory of electrons from atoms, and you couldn't see the atoms. Right? You couldn't see the scattering either. You saw the electrons as they came off. Yeah. So got to build a picture of what happened. And it's lots of fun. So in some cases not observable. Yeah. Following Faraday and Maxwell, we've come to understand the reality of fields that are in the main directly unobservable. So electric fields are not generally observable. So the fields that hold that chair together we don't observe. Indeed, it is an understanding of the reality of these fields that lies behind the theoretical constructs of special relativity. Right? These theoretical constructs have sufficient differentiability to be able to be correlated with all physical situations, but not all the possibilities that they have inside the fields are physically realised. Right? So again, it's this thing where mental space, field space can be bigger than what's going on. All right? Now, then there's a whole stack of stuff which you're welcome to read. I can post this paper on the website if you like, Bruce. But now, let me just get into this bit about biology. Right? Torrance notes that biology is yet to be able to develop a similar level of precision in its theoretical constructs. In other words, he's saying, how do you think about biology? Right? And how well do we think about biology? And the answer is extraordinarily badly. Right? Going to a doctor is a bit like, just give me a sec here. Great to see you again, John. Really was. Jane, lovely to meet you too. Yeah. I knew John 30 years ago, so it's good to see him again. Going to see a doctor is a bit like going to see a mechanic who doesn't understand how a motor car is built. Okay? But they understand something about how the motor car is built. Now, believe me, I'm more than happy to go and see Bruce because he knows a lot more about the motor car than I do. Right? But I got to tell you, the amount we know is a schmick. We don't know much at all, and we'd like to know more, don't we, Bruce? Yeah, we'd love to know more, and that's part of the richness, I think, of what we've got in front of us. But the thing is, so we don't have a lot of precision about the biology of the human body, for instance, and we'd like to get some more. And so what he says is, we'd like to know what is strictly in accordance with the actual nature of things and their inherent rationality. We'd like to know how they really work. And he says one of the ways to do that is to get out of a narrow and rigid dualism and to get into a field theory, get into something that permeates all kinds of things. Now, I don't want to go on here much further, but the interesting thing is that the essay goes on and discusses the notion of energia, which if you talk to Orthodox people will tell you an awful lot about the notion of energia, by which they mean the energies that come from God. And those energia are, if you like, the things that uphold the world. Right? So these energies that come out of God are the things that uphold the world, as they're understood in Orthodox theology. Right? As I said, there's a lot of charlatans out there. That's my problem, and that's why I'm nervous on this topic. because a lot of people into some crackpot bits about energy, and I think that all kinds of things in Oriental medicine, which have to do with things like acupuncture and stuff, actually are tapped into something really deep and really important. Right? I have a beautiful friend who is a doctor in Mount Gambier, and she's done some amazing things with pain relief and changing the physical structure of scars and all kinds of things using electronic means of tapping into this kind of field theory inside the body. But how much do we understand about it? About zip, right? And we're trying to build up an understanding of it, and that's what makes me nervous here. I'm extremely nervous about building confidence in something that isn't necessarily uphill. Okay, look, probably time to quit, and thank you very much for your patience.